Hello, this is Stephen Coates. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture. As usual, we're going to be talking about
what would come to be known as the counterculture.
Teenage savages go wild in a juvenile jungle of lust and lawlessness.
And I believe with all of my heart that it is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today. I 100% believe it. Why I believe that is because I know how it feels when you sing it. I know what it does to you. And I know the evil feeling that you feel when you sing it. I know the lost position that you get into in the beat. Well, if you talk to the average teenager of today and you ask them what it is about rock and roll music that they like, and the first thing they'll say is the beat, the beat, the beat.
That two-beat pattern is the music brought to the United
Smells
States
like
America.
teen spirit. That is the subject of this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture. But before we dive into that feverish, febrile, pheromone-filled phase of self-consciousness, sex, drugs and rock and roll, let me invite you to come and party with us. bureauoflostculture.com. Get our newsletter about upcoming shows, all sorts of other countercultural stuff, and you can support our wild endeavours. We appreciate this month Angie, Jimbo, Rox and Adrian for their support. Thank you so much. I also wanted to flag a couple of things. I have a book coming out in November with Strange Attractor Press in the UK and MIT in the US. It's called Bone Music. I probably talked about it before several times. It's all about the culture of forbidden underground music cut onto X-ray in the Soviet Union during the Cold War era. x-rayaudio.com. We've also got our annual Festival of Mortality and the City, London Month of the Dead, 56 events during October. Some in the city, some online, all sorts of mortal malarkey. LondonMonthOfTheDead.com. Now, I recently read a book called Stranger Than We Think, Making Sense of the 20th Century. It's a terrific read. It did actually help me make some sense of the 20th century. And my guest today is its author, John Higgs. He's also the author of various books on counterculture, including Timothy Leary, one on the KLF, and William Blake, and most recently James Bond and the Beatles. He came to the Bureau to talk about all things counterculture and the evolution of the teenager. Welcome, John.
Hello, Stephen. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you too. Well, listen, welcome to the Bureau. And, you know, I've said it to you before, and I'm not just puffing smoke up you, but your book, Stranger Than We Can Imagine, Making Sense of the 20th Century, it did actually start to make sense of the 20th century for me. I don't think that's a compliment for an author.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't call it Making Sense of the 20th Century or Your Money Back. I wasn't that confident, but, you know, it works occasionally.
How do you make sense of the 20th century? You know, I've written a couple of books on a specific subject. Interpreting the 20th century, it's just like, I don't even know how you begin to do that. You know?
Well, you just begin, and it took 5 drafts. It wasn't until about, towards the end of the 3rd draft that I realised what my story was, what my sort of theme was. The first few versions just didn't have it. It was just here's some stuff and here's some stuff and here's some stuff. By the 3rd draft, there was a moment when it all sort of fell into place. So I wrote the 4th draft to sort of sketch it out properly and sort of explain the whole sort of the arc of individualism and all that sort of stuff. At which point you've got your story. So then you do your 5th draft to make it look effortless.
Okay, so it's not like you sort of, you sat sort of looking out at the English Channel down in Brighton thinking about the 20th century. And then
well, there was a lot of that, but it wasn't like I got the answers from that. You only get the answers from doing it, right. Sitting down and writing that. There is, I admit, an act of faith in that. It is a bit of a sort of, you leap and you hope that you will come up with something at the end. But those are always the books that need writing, really. If you sort of know what it's going to be, it probably doesn't need writing. It's probably already been said.
So did you have the idea to write this a narrative of the 20th century first, or did you start writing your ideas about this and then it turned into the book that it is? But was your initial idea to set out to do something like this, or did that evolve?
It came from, I wrote a book about Timothy Leary. And when I was looking at that period of America at that time, I'd often be surprised by things. Like I was really surprised by how Silicon Valley grew out of that sort of psychedelic, main part of California, that psychedelic sort of ground zero, and how connected it was, and how it was the students taking acid who were going, we should have computers of our own, when their teachers like, oh, that's just stupid. No house could deal with a computer. That's insane. But it was the young heads who wanted it and who sort of made it happen. And that was unexpected to me. You look at Silicon Valley, it's corporate, it's finance, it's right. Technology. You don't think it comes from, the same sort of spark as that. So that's what made me think, I'm sure if I looked again at the 20th century, there's a more interesting story than the one we're being told, which was just like, Hitler and, the usual sort of attempt at the 20th century. Didn't actually know all of what it was at that point, but you just know it's a rich subject, and if a subject's rich, you should be able to do something with it.
And we're going to talk, John, about chapter 11, because it kind of links it for me with the emergence of the teenager as a sort of new thing. You start off with What Bombalula, What Bamboo, the Little Richard, and for you, that 1955 2-minute song, you describe it in there in terms of like youth culture, teenage culture, and even counterculture as year zero. Why?
Well, it was new. It was so new. Just nobody had heard human expression like that before. You can see it in Jojo Rabbit. There's a World War II film, but he starts it with the Beatles version, I Want to Hold Your Hand, but in German, because they recorded it in German. And it's odd because it's so ahistorical. There's that sort of level of energy and, direct, heartfelt human connection with guitars and with noise and with energy and that's so vivid. You just didn't get that in the 1940s. It just wasn't there. It's wrong that it's there. It's a choice by the filmmaker that sort of put it there. Once you grow up in a world where there are people like Little Richard, you can never really think what it would be like to live in a world where nobody had ever experienced anything like it. What's normal to us now was just unthinkable.
I hadn't thought of it before, but he was transgressive, wasn't he?
Oh, on every level, yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was black, he was gay, he was, I suppose you would now call him trans. I don't think, you don't want to project these things backwards in time too much, but that's probably a good example. He was everything that the establishment feared, but it was wonderful. Right. It was so attractive. It was so appealing. It was spellbinding, which is just dangerous for the establishment. Here's something that's not us, right? But it's better. It was that.
I wanted to read you something. As I was saying a little bit earlier, my research into what was going on in the Soviet Union in sort of 50s and 60s. And one of the people that I interviewed a few years back, Kolya Vasin, known in Russia until his death a couple of years ago, as the Beatles guy. That became apparent a bit later. But I was interviewing him about the phenomena of, music which was cut onto X-ray film, forbidden music in the Soviet Union. And I was asking him about the first time he saw an X-ray record. He first saw an X-ray record in 1957 when a friend came to his house after school and showed him a disc saying, "Look, Kolya, this is American rock and roll." He took the soft, flexible record in his hand, looked at it through the light and saw the image of Bones. Immediately he was fascinated. And then when he put the record on the gramophone and it started spinning, he heard wild singing. He was delighted by this ecstatic screaming voice and fell back stupefied. "Who's this?" His friend said it was Little Richard and the song was Tutti Frutti. Kolya immediately became a convert at the Church of Rock and Roll. And subsequently to that, he then goes in search of these records himself, and he goes into town on the subway, and he sees this dealer guy, standing under a colonnade, and he says, "I still remember that he came out from behind a column and said, 'Come with me,' and we followed him to a dark, badly lit corner. Then he took out an entire roll of Bones records and started offering them to us, saying, 'This is Bill Haley, this is Little Richard, that's Elvis Presley, what do you want?' I said, 'Tutti Frutti, give me Tutti Frutti.'" The reason I mentioned that was that it's only a couple of years later, and it had somehow got into the Soviet Union, a completely different culture, and yet it had the same incandescent, incendiary effect on young people there. So why? Why was this something which was, pan Iron Curtain? What was going on with young people?
Well, it's fascinating if you look back at books or films or stories from, the 1940s, even the 1950s. There's children, right? There's like boys, and they wear short trousers. And then they leave school and they immediately dress as their dad and they go to work, and they're expected to have children and a family straight away. And like if a woman wasn't, married by the age of 23, it would be like a bit shocking. People would be like talking about it. It was just a sudden, abrupt shift from childhood to adulthood. But this adolescence started to appear, this sort of gap in between, and it started to sort of expand. And if you look biologically, species that have long childhoods are more intelligent. Chimps or whatever, a longer period of childhood leads to, and it's obvious really, the longer you're not responsible and you can sort of think about things and work out the world and so forth, the more clued up you're going to be when you have to take that responsibility. And as the world's got more and more complicated, and as our media's sort of sped up, and as people suddenly had, they had radio, but now they would have TV, and then they'd have, videos, and then they'd get the internet, and then they'd get smartphones and stuff like that. The amount of information that's been flooding us it just increased exponentially. What a 14-year-old knows about the world now blow the mind of a 50-year-old in the year 1912. It would be incredible. It absolutely should. So it sort of makes sense that our childhoods had this sort of artificial extending sort of period. But what's interesting culturally is this is also the period where they look at the world and try and work out who they are and how they fit in it. Childhood's a bit more straightforward. You play, and there's a small world play where you play with toys, toy soldiers or toy cars or whatever, and you imagine the world and you're trying to understand it. But you're not really much of an active agent in it. When you get older and you start to try and work out who you need to be in this sort of thing, that's the really interesting part of adolescence, because they look at the world as it is now and adapt to it. And the generation older is horrified. They go, "That's not how we were. That's just, my God, this is awful. Look at that. Children these days, it's just absolutely awful." But it's an absolute, it's not like a generation grow up and all of a sudden they're just idiots unlike everyone else. Every generation adapts to the world it finds itself in, and they will see it fresh, with fresh eyes. And not sort of rely on perceived wisdom about how things are. So they get quite a really sort of accurate perception of the world and create what they think is needed in response.
So going back to the 40s then, of course, Second World War changes everything. And particularly, I guess, in this part of the world, but also in America too, doesn't it? So ushers in this new age of materialism, sort of security. There's plenty of stuff to eat, and there's jobs, and there's, certainly in America anyway, there's jobs, and there's as you said, nobody's firing at you, not until you get to this Vietnam War. But it's a new age. You talk about Aleister Crowley's vision of it. The patriarchal age is ending and the age of the crowned and conquering child is here.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It's something historically new then. I mean, you mentioned that about the way men looked. Pictures of my great-grandfather and my grandfather, they're kind of indistinguishable, You sort of grew a mustache, I think, when you were sort of 15 or 16 and started wearing a jacket and a tie.
Well, you wanted to be seen as a man, you didn't you didn't want to be seen as a child anymore. You know, that was the sort of thing. But yeah, you're absolutely right. America was the hotbed of all this. And America, you know, obviously didn't get blown to pieces in the Second World War and had this huge economic boom after it, spurred on by all the technology that was developed. And so, you know, the rock and roll appearing in this generation that suddenly had money, and because they had money, they had cars. Because they had cars, they had independence, and because they had independence, they could, you know, have sex and go off and have parties and everything that we would all want, you know, at that period before we had responsibility to be unleashed and to have that sort of freedom away from the eyes, you know, of the bosses to come or the teachers of the past or the present parents, where you're just yourself. You can just sort of be yourself. It's hardly surprising that the values that they had developed in that context were not the values that the people before
the invention of the 7-inch record, 1949.
Yeah, so democratic, so everyone could afford, and you could probably take them to your bedroom. You know, for the first time, maybe you'd have a dance set record player. You'd have something in your room to listen to music. There'd be a radiogram in the living room beforehand, you know, but to have that private space and to hear, you know, those boys sort of saying they want to hold your hand or asking, please me, or something like that, in your own room was very, very intimate. And it was such a powerful thing that, you know, obviously all the Beatlemania erupted and the screaming began. But you know, the technology had just arrived at just the right point to sort of to make less of a gap between the band and the audience. You know, it was a personal thing. When you buy a 7-inch record, you sort of, that music was you now. You know, your record collection was an important part of who you are. It's why people were so furious when U2 sort of forced that album onto people's iPod. You know, that was a sacred space, your record collection. You know, it was so wrong when they sort of did that.
Well, you talk about the fact that very quickly the teenagers sort of identified as this group that you can sell things to as well. The advertisers are all over them, right? And they've got, particularly in America, they've got disposable income, and so they can, and more freedom, I suppose. And for the older generation, that was quite a shock, wasn't it? Because they'd grown up in maybe in the 30s of, you know, with deprivation, and then 40s with the conflict, and then there's their kids who've got everything, sort of just, you know, spending it on booze, drugs, records, and electric guitars.
My father seems to have already settled down, settled into his ways, knows what's right, knows what's wrong. And every time I want to say something to him, I don't want to be settled down. Even no matter what I say, this is not a final decision. I want to just sort of try things out. And trying things out on parents never seem to work. You can't try things out. So the best thing I can do with my father is tell jokes. I mean, that's sort of, you know, that's something, because that's sort of, you know, that's all right, that's safe. It doesn't get you into problems.
I had a strong feeling that these children were rebels without a cause. They had everything. They could have had everything. And I found it very hard to see what they were rebelling against, and I couldn't see what they had that was going to replace it or that was better. It could possibly be better.
Being happy. Just being happy. No matter how, if you're happy, then you're a success. I mean, if you're a bum and you're happy being a bum, you should stay a bum.
This ongoing shift from people understanding themselves as individuals, which is the main theme of that book, Strange Than We Can Imagine. The start of the century, it was that hierarchical world. People were sort of judged on where they were in the hierarchy. Not whether they were a good person or a clever person or a funny person. It mattered whether they were a duke or a stable boy or a doctor or whatever. The shift to seeing people as individuals, which had been coming from the Enlightenment, but really cracked open and really became mainstream after the Second World War. That individualism really kick-started the uproar of youth culture that we still, you know, look back and admire on today. To the extent that we still talk of the counterculture, right? Even though it's a counterculture, you know, there's always countercultures throughout history. There's tons of different countercultures at any one particular time. But to think of yours is the only one, right? This is the only one. That phrasing as the counterculture is very telling, and it says a lot about it. And, you know, I love that counterculture, and I'm grateful for so much of what was in it. But you can see the self-first framing of it in a different light these days, I think.
It's come up on this show, before. There's always been countercultures. I mean, you talk about the Sufis, don't you? You talk about sort of the followers of Socrates, and even in London, there was these kind of, street gangs and stuff like that. There was always stuff going on, wasn't there? Which is countercultural. I mean, how do you define counterculture, and what is it that makes it?
Well, it's obviously in opposition to the prevailing culture. That kind of implies there's one single prevailing culture, which isn't really always the case. But leaving that aside, it's almost like an R&D department to try and find a better way than the existing culture. It's not in sync with its values or its reward structures or anything like that. It's just trying to find a better way. Trump voters in America would see themselves as a counterculture. They would say that the prevailing culture was like Ivy League, university educated, in a city, globalist, out of touch, arrogant, all those sort of things.
Elitist, mainstream.
Oh, yeah, exactly. All that sort of stuff. And they were a counterculture to it, right? But just because they're counterculture doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to produce something valuable or find a better way, which is how we tend to sort of judge these sort of things. If a counterculture produces, like an R&D department comes up with something new and brilliant and that sort of improves the world, then that's a good counterculture. But not all countercultures do that.
In terms of like the teenagers that evolved into what they described themselves as the counterculture, what was the connection then? So for the Beats in America, they were a bit old. People like Burroughs was a bit older, wasn't he? And maybe Ginsberg a little bit older. But I guess they were coming out of that post-war youth uprising thing as well, were they?
Yes, they were. As you say, they were a bit older. But they were the really the seeds. They were really where it comes from. It's like before the Impressionists, you'd get like Manet, who weren't quite Impressionists, but really that's where it all sort of comes from. The ideas that the Beats were pursuing and pressuring were the ideas that the, in quotes, counterculture were mad for, with the sense of individual liberation, all the music of freaking out, all that sort of stuff. Those were where the seeds sort of came from. These strange poets and hillheads from the wartime period. So the teenager sort of emerges, rock and roll emerges in the 50s. Isn't just America, it's here too. And as I found out, it was in the Soviet Union, not just people like Kolya Vasin. In the Soviet Union, there was a youth culture, the only youth cultures Artemy Trotsky calls it, which was the Stylyagi. Today he dances, tomorrow he will sell his homeland. This is a sidebar about the Soviet youth culture teenagers call the Stylyagi. It's from my upcoming book, Burn Music. And what was a Stylyagi? Often interpreted as dude or hipster, Stylyagi translates as stylist or style hunter, though follower of fashion perhaps better conveys its meaning. The term was intended to be derogatory, just as beatnik, hippie, punk and goth were in the West. But it was adopted, just as they were, as a badge of honour by those it lampooned. They were antisocially individualistic, unpatriotically aped Western fashions, culturally ignorant and were shallow. But veteran Russian cultural commentator Artemy Trotsky says the Stylyagi were important because they publicly risked being different at a time when difference could be dangerous. Certainly, they originally took their inspiration from the US music and style scenes which were disseminated during and after World War II. But as clothes couldn't be imported from the West, the Stylyagi started making them themselves. The guys initially wearing super wide trousers and getting their mothers and sisters to knit sweaters with reindeer designs, or cutting wildly patterned neckties from curtains. The style evolved until it settled around a version of the British teddy boy or Grease-era US 1950s rock and roll look. Now the boys favoured trousers with narrow legs, thick crepe-soled shoes, loud patterned shirts and garish jackets. The girls wore heavy makeup, heels, pantsuits, or brightly coloured short skirts. They sported elaborate hairstyles with quiffs and perms. It was a cartoonish version of the original, but it certainly stood out in the USSR, as it was intended to, when they paraded up and down a big city avenue, chewing gum made of paraffin wax, talking loudly in their own lingo, combining Russian, criminal slang, vulgarity and hip US talk.
They called Nevsky Prospect Broadway, apartments suitable for private parties, huts, and they called each other American names like Bob, Bud, Eddie, Polly and Betsy. Boogie woogie, swing and jazz were their music of choice until rock and roll arrived. Some Stilyagi were the children of higher party ranks, the privileged golden youth jet set, who were the main source of information about the West because they could travel abroad or get hold of Western magazines and records. Others were from families of the intelligentsia, the children of doctors, engineers and teachers, and there were also ordinary working class kids. As has often been the case, pop culture, music and style acted as a class leveller in ways that ideology could not. The Stilyagi were the Soviet example of a family of youth subcultures sprouting through the Eastern Bloc. In Hungary were the Jampacek, a word used derisively from the late 20s to variously describe disaffected youth gang members, spivs, slackers, teenage dandies, hooligans, beats or hipsters. Like the Stilyagi, the Jampacek of the 50s and 60s sported flashy US-influenced clothes and hairstyles, partied, disdained the value of their parents, and generally annoyed the establishment. In Poland, there were the Bikinazi, and in Czechoslovakia, the Potapka. In Romania, the Malangabisti. Like their Western counterparts in the earlier French Zazus, or the German Swing and Juden, the Swing Kids, they all used music and clothes to distinguish themselves from the older generation and their more conventional peers. Antagonism to these Cold War kids was partly based on their espousal of foreign values, but it was part of a general, worldwide social anxiety shared in the West about youth culture. On one hand, they were seen as a new and attractive group of potential customers, and on the other, antisocial tearaways, hooligans, disrespectful of their elders, ungrateful, spoilt, entitled, lazy, immoral, and a sign of the decay of society. That shock was largely expressed through the media, with hysterical features and alarmist op-eds, often focused on the harmful effects of rock and roll.
Rock and roll in the 1950s, which would fire you up. The notion that you then go out and slash the seats in the cinema was a very sort of rock and roll sort of thing. Teddy boys being violent. It was sort of it would create this energy that you just spurt outwards. It was an outward expression of energy that you couldn't quite funnel in a productive or any way. So rock and roll people would slash the seats, but in Beatles concerts, people used to wet the seats, or the female young teenage audience. It was a thing of surrender.
Absolutely. So I talked earlier about Kolya Vasin, the kid who came across Little Richard in Leningrad. But he went on to become a huge Beatles fan, the Beatles guy, as he became known, in fact, later on. And I mentioned that he went out to get some more Bone records from a bootlegger or a dealer, and hoping to buy more Little Richard. But in fact, he was given a record which, when he got it home, played it on his mum's blue Jubilee gramophone player. It started to play, and it turned out that it was actually They Can't Buy Me Love by the Beatles. Of course, that was always one of the things with buying these records. You're never quite sure what somebody was going to give you. When he played it, he fell back again. Tutti Frutti was one thing, but when he heard the Beatles, he was completely converted. This is what he said to me at the end. He said, "They are the joy of my life. It's a prize that I thank God for every night, saying, thank you, Lord, that today I listen to such holy music, and it's been this way these past 50 years. When I heard them, I heard something so phenomenal that even the great Little Richard, whom I had adored, faded for me. They enlightened me. Little Richard was happiness, but the Beatles were insanity, something else, the limit, something unexplainable. And I understood everything. And then I started building them a shrine."
February 1964.
We came here at 6 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 to see them, and all they do is push you farther and farther away, and then they don't even let you see them.
And it was blissful. Your ego was just gone, and you just surrender, and you just sort of give yourself over to something larger. This was a real sort of big sort of shift, and this is kind of unstoppable. That once you've gone from the shift between wanting to slash the seats to sort of to wet the seats, this is powerful. This is a powerful impact it is having on people.
I love that. It's amazing. Before we move on to the 60s, I wanted just to read you something. But listen to this. There are rumblings, wails and howls like the smarting of a metal pig, the shriek of a donkey, or the amorous croaking of a monstrous frog. Bestial cries are heard, neighing horses, wild screaming, hissing, rattling, wailing, moaning, cackling. The insulting chaos of insanity pulses to a throbbing rhythm. Listening to this screaming music for a few minutes, one involuntarily imagines an orchestra of sexual maniacs led by a man-stallion beating time with an enormous phallus. It goes on. That's Maxim Gorky talking about jazz. But the extraordinary thing about it, two things about it, is that it was the same sort of thing that just people in America were saying about Elvis, you know, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, exactly the same thing. But also, if you heard that as a young person, isn't your response going to be, I want some of that?
Yeah. Yeah. Because if you'd grown up in a society that said all that was bad, you're just assuming that people that you're writing to see the world in the same way you do. But of course, they're just coming up and they're seeing the world and they're trying to make sense of it. And they ain't going to see the world in the same way you do. And so things that can seem awful to an older demographic can be so appealing and so right.
Because rock and roll is cool, you know? Yeah, I see. Well, now, what do you think?
I think that rock and roll is real fancy rock and roll, and I like it.
Like it? What do you think?
I think that man must have been nowhere because rock and roll is cool, Daddy, and you know it. Rock and roll is the most, and if they stop that, they ain't gonna have no more music. That music sends me, man. It sends me. You guys dig that music all the way. Oh, man, that's crazy music, that music there, rock and roll. He should have let that go on. That was crazy music, man. That sends me, Jack.
What do you think about them banning rock and roll in Jersey City?
I think it's just great. I don't know why the heck the government told them to stop it. I think it's just...
What do you think?
Well, I think all teenagers like rock and roll. It's great to everybody.
What does it do for you?
It makes you feel good inside.
It does?
Very much. Well, me, it makes me happy. I don't know, it puts me in a good mood.
Rock and roll was really dismissed in very racist terms. It was like it was the music of the jungle. It was like savages having sex and all this sort of stuff. Man, that sounds great to the younger generation. You know, that's really not the insult that they thought it was.
That's it. So we moved into the 60s and 70s, and you make this distinction. It's like the Stones and the Beatles represented two different streams of consciousness in a way. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the Beatles and LSD, which is, you know, what we think of as the 60s, was kind of going against the grain of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, which was all about this growing sense of individualism. There was a sense that, you know, people like Mick Jagger or punks in the 70s or Thatcherites in the 80s or, you know, Britpoppers in the 90s were all on the same path, which was I want, you know, and I want to do this. And it sort of built until it became this weird sort of edgelord sort of culture that the teenagers now mock mercilessly. But all that, you know, I can't get no satisfaction. You can't always get what you want. They're all sort of focused on you, and you're understanding the world through the notion of you and what you want. Very Thatcher, very Aleister Crowley. There's a link that runs all the way through the 20th century. And in fact, one thing I didn't realize I'd finished that book was there's sections of Margaret Thatcher's speeches that are identical to the writings of Aleister Crowley. Both of them say, man has the right to work as he will, right? Things like that. They're exactly the same. That was the sort of prevailing sort of growth of individualism in the 20th century. And the Beatles weren't that. And acid wasn't that. And All You Need Is Love wasn't that. That was a very, very different thing. And I mean, the Stones fit in exactly with the century, I think, definitely.
You do say that Mick Jagger was an admirer of Thatcher, which is kind of awful thought somehow, isn't it? But, you know, Keith, it sort of makes sense. It does make sense, yeah. Whereas, and Keith Richards' sort of version of it was like, you know, massively hedonistic and flaunting it. You talk about the fact that he completely unnecessarily, sort of when they were in Arkansas, took off in this yellow soft top sports car packed with drugs in a kind of very, difficult part of America to do that, for no reason whatsoever, it would seem, apart from the sheer hell of it, right?
It's Keith Richards, where he says, we needed to do what we wanted to do.
Yeah.
That sums it up perfectly, I think.
So there's always these two things going on. On one hand, there's the raw energy of me, which is we've all been through as a teenager, sort of focused on, on yourself and possibly your peers to the exclusion of everything else. And then the other stream of stuff is, which gets represented by the Beatles and amplified by LSD, but is also there in the beats, is this other regarding sort of wider consciousness thing too, which of course in the later part of the 60s starts to influence everything, not just music, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, modern 21st century teenagers are very different, I think. I don't think they would, they're swept along by the same interests that Keith Richards or the Rolling Stones were sort of being driven to. But at that point in history, yeah, that does seem a fair description of it. And the clash between I want and surrendering of the ego to have a transcendent experience that makes life worthwhile.
This country, at this time, needs something that it hasn't got.
Yes.
What does it need?
Love. The whole people have to know each other,
What about people older than, say, 30? Older people, do you think they can indulge in this too?
Yes, they should.
Do they?
I don't know if they do, but they should.
What do you think older people think of all this?
Most of them think it's ridiculous.
Why do you think they think it's ridiculous?
Because I don't think it can be done.
Are you a part of the love generation?
Yes.
Do you love me?
Yes, I love everybody.
Is it possible to love everybody?
Yes.
How come? How come people haven't loved everybody for 2,000 years?
Because they've been mixed up.
To take drugs?
Yes.
You would?
Yeah.
Why?
I'm experimental. I'm experimental.
That's quite a culture war. That's quite a sort of clash sort of going on at that. And you can see that running all the way through the sort of 60s.
It sort of crashed a bit in the 70s, didn't it? When you said that the punks sort of turned their back on the sort of the hippies' dreaminess and stuff like that. It becomes kind of risible or and embarrassing. But yeah, it doesn't go away. And I think one of the things which has come up in the Bureau of Lost Culture, even last episode when I interviewed Craig Sams, brought macrobiotic eating to the UK. Several things which actually had their origins in that late 60s love fest became part of everyday mainstream society now.
Absolutely. And Craig Sams is a really important part. I was saying earlier about how the counterculture is kind of like an R&D department for the broader culture. It is trying things and coming up with things. And when it comes up with something that's a good idea, then we all benefit. And now, the huge rise in veganism for climate reasons, particularly among the young generation. It was so funny seeing, the older reactionary journalists freaking out about the idea of like a vegan sausage roll at Greg's. The Piers Morgans of the world, they were just filled with horror with this sort of idea. And to anyone younger, the notion that could fill anyone with horror is just so strange. And that's one of those real sort of moments where you go, oh, we have come a long way, haven't we? Because that older reactionary sort of attitude is now so absurd. It looks so sort of stupid.
And yet it's kind of perennial too, though, isn't it? And it's like, maybe it should be, in the sense that like the eternal teenagers turn into 20-year-olds, or turn into 30-year-olds, and they have kids and they settle down. Not always, of course, but I mean, that's part happening. And then they get old, and of course they start to then condemn their own teenagers, don't they? They start to find their own teenagers shocking, and maybe they've got some nostalgia for their own youth, shocked by their teenagers' youth as their parents were too, right?
They form their identity at a particular point in time. And by doing so, they changed the culture and they changed the world. So when their children forms their identity at this later point, it's a very different world. So they become very sort of different people. And so the people who are formed at this earlier time always find it difficult. They always can't quite understand. how flexible and how good we are with change. It varies across society. There's what they call neophobic people and neophiliac people. Neophobic hate change, and the notion that society is fragile and it can go horribly wrong, and changing it too much can have terrible consequences. And so hence, keep the status quo as much as you possibly can, because at least it sort of works. It's flawed, but it sort of works. And the neophiliacs they love change. Let's do something new. Let's do something different. We'll find something better. And there's this sort of clash between the two. What I was talking about earlier about how this adolescence sort of period opened up between childhood and adulthood, where they were sort of forming themselves. That period has sort of kept growing and kept growing and kept growing. And so to the millennials, the post-war generation, look like they've never really quite grown up. The fact that they all, become adults, but they still like Harry Potter, and they all go and see Spider-Man films and all this sort of thing, would have been deeply embarrassing to someone raised in the 1950s. It's the sense that if you can keep that playful, carefree period of not really being an adult going for as long as you can, then you can still adapt and change a bit more before you get fixed and you're sort of in your rut, and that's you now. You're not going to have any sort of major new revisions to your worldview because it's a fixed sort of thing, and it's the plasticity of the brain is sort of not quite what it was. You've got something that works for you and you just want to keep it like that. But the world is going in a sort of completely different way. But there is certainly, I don't know, I do have the sense that this sort of lengthening, extending period for even as much as you can mock, the Harry Potter fans who are, age 35. It's probably a good, because there's a level of sort of flexibility that we're keeping for longer. And hence we probably can understand a little bit more of what that generation is sort of doing. I've got friends who sort of formed in the 90s and then they drew a line, and anything after that, they're against it. They're at war against it. Ain't a useful way to be. It's reflected so much in our identity that we sort of feel a little bit offended if the world changes away from who we are, unless we were slightly rejected. We sort of identify with our worldview to a sort of extent that can be sort of difficult.
I've never conceived it in those terms before. So in a way, you're saying that after the Second World War, suddenly there's this kind of extenuation of adolescence. First of all, it becomes teenage, and then as the decades go on, is that the point at which the sort of teenage or the adolescent ends and become an adult gets further and further away from your birth. And it's a sort of thought, isn't it? Because you're absolutely right. I mean, if you go to a festival now, it's, parents, possibly even grandparents are there with their grandkids watching the same bands, possibly even taking the same drugs, or wearing Converse trainers. And I can see that in a way there is something amazing about that, of course. And also, it's quite a thought that if it carries on getting attenuated, that people will actually die before they get old, which was also, of course, always the there was the dream. I mean, you're actually chronologically you're old, but in fact, you've not actually left adolescence by the time you're 80. It's that's something quite horrifying about it. But also, doesn't it in some way rob teenagers of their own period?
They sort of hide their culture from us in really interesting ways. We don't think they have any, but my God, they have. And it's so multi-layered and rich, and there's too many references. We can't follow it.
There is always something going on. There's
always something going on, of course.
Yeah. There's always an underground, there's always a counterculture going on. But you yourself in the book, and as I mentioned earlier, Alan Moore and Michael Moorcock all kind of gave it sort of 40 years. But for them, obviously, a certain generation sort of like expired or sort of faded out in the kind of late 80s and 90s, because of Thatcher. Johnny Marr actually saw it that way too. He saw, particularly in Manchester in the north, he saw the impact of Thatcherism and how that sort of stomped on communities, but also on the idea of being in community, and that it elevated the everyone for themselves ethos into the ascendancy. Is there a sense that the classic counterculture that we talk about, that it did sort of run out of steam?
The change you're talking about is really connected to the rise of the internet. And the rise of the internet is connected to the bypassing of gatekeepers. So when we had gatekeepers to get, music on a 7-inch single, or a story on a book or in a comic in a shop or something like that. You have to get through all these sort of gatekeepers. Really sort of, it was a really harsh filter. It really sort of kept things from happening to a large degree. And the punks and the hippies before them were really good at sort of trying to get past that and have their own press and have their own sort of shops. And one result of that was that things really needed to sort of build up and get enough pressure before they could explode out into the world. So when a new scene arrived, bam, it was fully formed, and bam, it was there and everything like that. With the need for that pressure gone, things just sort of gently froth up and come through, and new ideas sort of part there. But they're not a thing. They're not a gang of ideas together. It's not a bunch of people who all see the world very different, and they create this entirely sort of new culture, and bam, now we're all different.
It was the effect of the internet, right? Of course it was, because it made the distribution of trends so much quicker. There's barely time to get one going, sort of thing, before it's already sort of spread. And Jonathan Green, who is the lexicographer of slang, talking to him about where all the 60s words, hip, chick, dope, bang, all this sort of stuff came from. And he was sort of saying, well, they came from Black America in the 20s, and it took sort of 40 years before they sort of like got to swinging 60s London. Because he charts this stuff. He says now it takes about 40 days for a word that emerges in Black America to make it onto the streets of London.
So there has been sort of a weird sort of phase shift, if you will, but I mean, it doesn't mean there's not no imagination anymore. It doesn't mean there's nothing sort of going on. It doesn't mean that things were better then. It's just different now.
Do we need a new technology or a new drug? I mean, charting that movement from rock and roll through skiffle and beat, and jazz and psychedelic movement into big rock and punk and new wave and and rave and hip hop and from the electric guitar through to the synthesizers to the sampler and then the computer, and then the drugs have changed, haven't they, from all the way through from weed and acid and cocaine and MDMA, and it's evolved, and those things have gone in parallel, haven't they? The sort of technology of music, the new drug.
There's a new state of consciousness, a new experience of being, a new way of feeling. People will try and express that in their art. And so when there's a new drug or something like that, you've got a whole new state of consciousness that you can then try to express, and you try and use what tools are available to get that across, so that they're very, very linked, technology and states of mind. It's always an attempt to express being human, what the experience of being you is like. And we will always experience, being ourselves. And that has, because that's such a shifting and strange thing. If you were to take, a Stormzy album and go back in time and play it to someone in, 1914, they would just go, I just cannot comprehend why humans would make noises like this. I cannot relate to it in any way, shape, or form. And that's a sign of just how far we've changed and how far we've come.
Even though, we're going through a sort of renaissance, thankfully, in terms of reassessment of psychedelics, and that hopefully it will have an impact on culture too. But is it maybe then that those kind of drugs and that kind of technology, in some ways, the internet and the social media, which stimulates dopamine and serotonin, is it the blend of that has brought about this kind of new consciousness, that kind of technology? And
normally the shift between generations is kind of gradual. Like there was the baby boomers, and then I'm Generation X, and then there's the millennials, and we're different, but it just all sort of flows into each other. But occasionally there's a real break to the point that the generation before can't understand the next generation. And it happened with the silent generation to the baby boomers. Something is happening here and you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? It was sort of boasting about how the older people didn't get it. We'd all changed. Our values had changed. They just didn't get it. The rise of Generation Z compared to millennials, I think, is a similar real shift, a real sort of change. And it is the result of growing up not passively watching things on a TV, but interacting and being part of a network rather than when you do sort of grow up watching TV, you're kind of separate from it. This sense of being an individual, and there's a thing out there, and it may not have your best interest at heart, but you can't really do anything about it. You can't really control it. It's just the sort of thing is very different to sort of growing up online and not seeing yourself as separate. The sense that we're apart from everything, I think, has passed for people growing up now in the 21st century. And it's really a major shift. And it's why Generation Z can seem so strange to people like me who are sort of raised in the 20th century. It's been this massive, fundamental rewriting of how they understand their relationship with the universe. It's kind of a big deal.
In recent years, the conversations about gender and the whole thing about pronouns, and when people in their sort of 20s do it, or even younger, I sort of get it, right? But when it's kind of older people, it's like, are you just trying to be young? Isn't this their thing? Let them have their thing. It's not, you don't have to fight it, because the Piers Morgan thing, and the anti-woke brigade and all that sort of stuff, it's just the same thing again, isn't it? The kind of older generation putting down the younger generation, just in the way that parents in the 60s and 70s found their own kids gauche and, the way they were dressing and speaking sort of shocking or disturbing. And isn't it just the same thing?
And it does come from them seeing themselves as part of a network, part of a network of relationships, rather than as an isolated individual. Because once that happens, you get a level of responsibility for your actions that you didn't have before. You're sort of concerned about how you impact on other people. You're thinking a lot more about that. How are your actions impacting on other people in a way that, Keith Richards would never do, and so being sort of respectful and understanding of things. And it's part of the big rise in anxiety, because it's difficult and it's stressful, and it takes a lot of mental shift. But grow up with friends who they have gender dysphoria and how they're treated and how society treats them. And their reaction is to support, be there for them. And the generational shift in the understanding of trans issues is so striking. It's so apparent. I used to love Prince, right, when I was growing up. I remember seeing him on the Love Sexy tour, and I'd listened to Prince, but I had no idea what it meant that he had this female, alter ego called Camille, and his name was really a symbol that was both male and female, and all this. I just had no concept.
At the time, it was baffling, wasn't it? And now, of course, it sort of makes sense.
If I was your girlfriend, listening to sort of songs like that. And I only get it now because, I've got teenage kids, and they sort of explained it to me. And it's like, oh, okay, now I get it. And because their explanation makes sense of things in the world, particularly my Prince records, it's value. It's, I get it. I'm on their side. I sort of really understand it. Yeah.
So we're running out of time, John, but I wanted to sort of just wrap up with a couple of things from chapter 11 of the book. And first one, we end on this, and it's the sort of story of Kurt Cobain, and it's that counterpoint, I think, to how you began with Little Richard. I mean, very different kind of musicians, one's black, one's white, and the music's completely different and stuff. But what's quite moving about that is that he represented something, and of course, Smells Like Teen Spirit. We've been talking about teenagers, haven't we? All those values, the anti-mainstream, the anti-consumerism, in a way, the Beatles type stuff, right, which he stood for, it couldn't stand up to the man. There's a sense that that's what killed him, isn't it?
It's easy to see it in those terms, certainly. Yeah, I mean, it does seem significant. It did at the time. I mean, I remember when he died, it wasn't, front page news of the newspapers. People didn't know Kurt Cobain. The older generation didn't know Kurt Cobain. But I remember the impact it had on me and the people I knew, and it really was. It was that sense of your voice, when the voice of your generation gives. It's odd. There'd always been these artists who would have this 10-year period of just pure inspiration, pure genius, where every album would just be unheralded and amazing, and heralded and amazing for about a 10-year period. The Beatles did it. David Bowie did it in the 1970s. I would argue Prince did it. And the 90s, it could easily have been Kurt Cobain. It was starting as if he was going to be the one. But that suicide, what you were saying earlier about how people identify the sort of mid-90s as the period when it all ended, it's symbolically. But I don't think we've got a good grasp on the 90s. I think there's a very sanitized sense of the 90s that sort of goes around, which is a bit sort of Tony Blair and Spice Girls and things like that. I think it was a lot more interesting.
Just the final one, I suppose, really is to go back all the way to Little Richard. And I just wanted to mention this thing which you plucked out of his biography, which seems significant, which is that he's 2 years after he's released this incendiary single, he's playing a concert in Australia and there's a fireball in the sky, and this event is what makes him actually stop being a rock and roller for quite a while and become a preacher.
You know, rock and roll and religion, really, they are joined. You know, ecstasy is ecstasy, you know, whether it's, you know, spiritual ecstasy or, you know, teenage exuberance, they really are sort of bound together. Yeah.
Quite smoothly from a sort of sexual ecstasy to a religious ecstasy. The amazing thing about it as well, of course, is that you think that actually that fireball was Sputnik, the Soviet satellite which had been launched, which of course then kind of metaphorically at least tied this whole thing into the space age as well. There was something global, almost global about it.
The whole world sort of changes and marches forward, different paces at different places, and then there's different factors, but that is what is happening. That is the overall story behind all this.
John, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you, Stephen. Great talking to you.
Thanks to John. I will put a link to John's website with all his books in the show notes. The book that we were mainly talking about was Stranger Than We Can Imagine, Making Sense of the 20th Century, but he's just got a new book out, Love and Let Die, Bond, the Beatles and the British Psyche. Perfect timing with all the changes that are going on in these islands. I hope you enjoyed that and maybe it reminded you of your teenage years. Maybe you're still in your teenage years. Certainly reminded me of mine. A very confusing time, but also absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I spent time desperate to get out of the place that I was born, travelling around England with my friend Glenn Duncan, exploring the psychedelic prehistoric landscape of Albion, something which I'm still kind of weirdly living out today. Come and join us. This show, I think, is about to leave its adolescence and enter its early 20s. Get in there. It'd be great to have you as part of our community, even just to get our newsletter and so we can communicate what is going on and what's coming up. You can also, of course, support our wild endeavours in any other way that you can. Even just by spreading the word. Let's bring back counterculture into the mainstream. I thought we'd finish with something in the spirit of this episode. This is the band Lazarus and the Plane Crash with their track, Naked and Nasty. See you next time.